Ta-da! All right, that's that. That's all that. All right. You guys ready? Everybody ready online? All right, today is Wednesday, March 29th, 2023, and this is my little Bible study, and we are back in the book of Exodus, chapter 23. We're going to pick it up in verse 10. All right, we're back in law again, okay? Now, the law that we just so happened to stumble across in our law study in the book of Exodus, and our line-by-line study, is starting out to work out pretty good, because it's also the law of Passover is what we're on right now. Passover's coming up here in less than a week, or about a week, right? Which we're going to get into a little bit more as we go. Now, we've already covered this, right? This is the law of Passover. This is Exodus. The first one was there in Egypt, right? Where either the firstborn was spared, or the firstborn was taken, and it was either a miracle or a curse, just depending on which side of the line you're standing on. All right? So that was the first Passover, right, where the destroyer had to skip over the houses that were marked with the blood of the Lamb on the first Passover. We learned there that it takes place in the month of Abib, and this should be the first of months to you. All right? Now, remember that the ancient Hebrews also had a civil calendar that they went by that was lunar, but we're talking about the religious calendar whenever I'm talking. I don't ever talk about their civil calendar usually. I'm always talking about the religious one. So, and that's the one that set off spring equinox. And that's where Abib, or what would later become known as Nisan, and that's where it always began, is on spring equinox. And the reason why is because we are children of the light. Book of John just draws that out up and down through it. Always watch the sun. The temple, I've mentioned this before probably, both the first and the second temple were oriented in a way that on the spring equinox, right,
the light would hit the
Ark of Covenant, right? So you'd open, there's two sets of gates. There's the outer gates, they'd open them, and then the inner gates, and then you'd have the inner where the inner sanctum where the Ark of the Covenant was. And then as soon as it comes up and shines right in on the Ark of the Covenant, and that only happens on the first day of spring. Now, so you're a little bit off, though, because you got that quarter day, right? And so what would happen over the next couple of years, then it would get off a little bit. So if it wasn't quite on, they would just wait till the next day, and it'd get right back on, so they would adjust for that little bit of an imbalance that we have for that quarter day that we have, that we use a leap year to adjust for. And that was how they adjusted for it on the solar calendar, right? But that makes it a very accurate calendar, right? So and what that means is that the sun in its orbit around the Earth in its orbit around the sun is in that exact position every year at that time. Right? So it's a very accurate way. Our calendar drifts because it's a lunar calendar, and we have to adjust for not enough day years and leap years and all those things. That's why we have this Mickey Mouse stuff that we do. But we're on the solar calendar. All right, so let's pick it up in verse 10. And 6 years south of we've already did that one, haven't we? That was where we, not verse 10. Verse 14, that's where we're going to pick it up. That's right. 3 times thou shalt keep a feast unto me in the year. All right. Verse 15, thou shalt keep the feast of unleavened bread. All right. The feast of unleavened bread is another term for the feast of Passover. All right. Which we talked a lot about when we did the original one. Right. Thou shalt keep the feast of unleavened bread. Thou shalt eat unleavened bread for 7 days, as I commanded thee, in the time appointed in the month of Abib. All right. For in it thou camest out from Egypt, and none shall appear before me empty. All right. So everybody brings it. This becomes the tithe, right? They would take their tithe and they would go to Jerusalem for the feast days. Now, so we got spring equinox, and the way everything's based off spring and the number 7. There's 7 days in creation. This is the easy way to remember it. 7 days of creation means spiritual completeness. All right? 2 sets of 7 is 14. That gets you to the 14th day of Abib. All right? When the sun goes down, the 15th day begins, and there's how you mark Passover. That Passover day is on that same solar day every year. The Earth is in that position in its orbit in its exactness. Let's go on to the next one. And the feast of the harvest, the first fruits of thy labor, which thou hast sown in the field, Okay, here's another one, all right, and the Feast of the Ingathering. Don't worry, we're going to cover these a little bit better, all right, which is in the end of the year. Well, now that's the third one. And then thy laborers in their field, 3 times a year, all thy males shall appear before the Lord God. All right? Now, some of these we've already covered, okay? So, first Passover was in Egypt, right? Well, the next place they do when they come out was the first place they camped was Succoth, right? And said this would later become one of the feast days in commemoration of that encampment. All right, Succoth means like huts or booths, all right, where they camped. All right, so this is the third that's called the Feast of Tabernacles now. And it's actually, that's the biblical name for it. It's also used in Israel today when you talk about the feast days. All right, now, bear in mind, when you look on the calendar, you're not going to get the biblical calendar. You're going to get the calendar adjusted for modern day, when we're talking about the feast days in Israel. Well, I'll show you in a little bit the calendar. You'll see that Passover begins on the calendar 2 days after it actually begins, right? So there's a little bit of discrepancy with it. Okay, now, I don't like how it breaks it down, so go over. My favorite book has always been Deuteronomy when it comes to law. All right, and that's in Deuteronomy chapter 16 where we're going to go. All right. Now, the reason why I prefer there's a reason for it. All right. These laws are also given in Numbers. All right. I don't like the ones in Numbers because they also include all the sacrifices and stuff that we don't even use, don't do anymore. They're included in chapter 28 of the book of Numbers where it covers these same 3 feasts again, but tells you what the sacrifices are for them. There's things to be learned from it, and that's great. But when I'm looking for law to help people or to help people understand, Deuteronomy is my go-to book because most of that law, when this is called, Deuteronomy is called the second telling or the second law. And it doesn't mean there's a second law, it just means the second time Moses told the law to the people. And when he does in the book of Deuteronomy, he leaves a lot of that stuff out like in Numbers. All that sacrifice stuff, a lot of it, and the stuff to do with a lot of the priests, that stuff's all, like in Leviticus, it's all absent from the law in the book of Deuteronomy. And the reason for that, I believe, is because Moses is looking long-term who Israel will become in the last days and saying this is the law that still applies to you people. That's kind of the simplistic sort of way that I break it down. But nonetheless, I like the way that it lays out the feast. 16:1, observe the month of Abib and keep the Passover unto the Lord thy God. For in the month of Abib the Lord thy God brought thee forth from the land of Egypt. All right? Thou shalt therefore sacrifice the Passover unto the Lord thy God of the flock and the herd, so it can be either a sheep or a goat, either one is acceptable for a Passover sacrifice, all right, in the place which the Lord shall choose to place his name there. All right, that place that he chooses to place his name initially becomes Jerusalem, right, where the temple is and where all this stuff activity already shaped, all right? And that was the actual place that was licensed for sacrifice to take place after Israel was established. Later, the temple will go away. What does he say? He said the place that he chose to place his name there. Well, the Old Testament tells us when the Messiah would be born to call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. So that is the place that he chose to place his name. God with us is Emmanuel. So that's talking about Christ himself. And that's the place then that we now pay our alms and our tithes and things like that. Not sacrifices, but still the things that we do in relationship with church and stuff like that. All right? And so everything that we're doing with that then still runs perfectly in alignment with law, even in the New Testament. All right, that's what it says. Verse 3, thou shalt eat no leavened bread with it. 7 days shalt thou eat unleavened bread within, even the bread of affliction. All right, and that's one of the names of it. One of the terms for Passover is the feast of the victim. And you'll see kind of where that comes from, all right? For thou camest forth out of the land of Egypt in haste. And that's what the bread is about, because he said, don't even wait for the bread to rise, all right? So that's a vital part in making bread. Don't wait, get it and go. So they didn't have time for the bread to rise, and that's why they have then the bread of affliction and in the Passover feast. All this remembering the encampments and the things that occurred in the Exodus itself, all right? That thou mayest remember the day when thou camest forth out of the land of Egypt all the days of thy life. Verse 4, and there shall be no leavened bread seen with thee in all thy coast 7 days. Neither shalt there anything of flesh which thou sacrificed the first day at even remaineth until the morning. All right, so I just simply remember what it said about the law, that if you had more than what you need, get your neighbor, right, and come and even it out, right, you had to burn it. You had to actually burn it. It wasn't an offering, it was just, I don't think it, let me rephrase that, I don't think it's a burnt offering. What I think it was that it was holy, and they didn't want anything to scavenge it, right, and if you just threw it out the next day, right, you would be scavenged, and you didn't want that. Because remember, this sacrifice actually represents Christ in every way. All right, and it's in fact on Passover, when the sun goes down on the 14th day of Abib is when Jesus is placed in the tomb. Right, and the stone is placed over, right. All right, he becoming the Passover sacrifice for all time. So this Passover feast is very important. It should be within Christianity, but it's often neglected, and we opt for Easter, which is not even aligned with Passover at all, which we've talked about before. I don't want to rehash any of that. But anyway, but there you have it, all right? Thou mayest not sacrifice the Passover within any of thy gates which the Lord thy God giveth thee. All right, but at the place which the Lord thy God shall choose to place his name in, there shalt thou sacrifice the Passover at evening, and the sun going down of the sun, and the season, at the season that thou comest forth out of the land of Egypt. All right? All pretty self-explanatory. Now, let's rework this, because the original one was like this, that they did take it in their home. Remember, he's going to put it here in Jerusalem. Now is where it's going to take place, right? Because that's eventually where Christ was going to be sacrificed. But if you remember, the original one went out was when at the sun going down, that wherever you were in your home was when you sacrificed the Passover lamb. Everybody at the same time. And it goes from being individual as a nation to a group, to an activity that takes place as a nation, okay? So originally it was how it would take place. When the sun was going down on the 14th day of Abib, you sacrificed the lamb that you chose 10 days prior. Then you cleaned him and took care of it and raised it and brought it in the house, made it all pretty, and then that was the sacrifice. So you get a little bit of a change as Israel actually becomes established then, and Jerusalem becomes the center point, with first the temple being built, then with the first temple being built. All right, verse 7, thou shalt roast and eat it in the place which the Lord thy God shall choose, and thou shalt turn in the morning and go in unto thy tents. 6 days shalt thou eat unleavened bread, and on the 7th day it shall be a solemn assembly to the Lord thy God, and thou shalt do no work therein. Okay, so each set of feast days then is encapped with a Sabbath day, is what it's actually showing. So you come into Passover, 14th day of Abib. Sun goes down, the 15th day begin, that's your first Sabbath. That's called the high Sabbath. Okay, every 7 days thereafter then is a Sabbath day. And it's just counted that way, and exactly that way. All right? Now, I want to go back to the unleavened bread thing, all right? So I think it's real important to cover. Now, traditionally, like at my house, we'd serve unleavened bread with Passover. My dad, he has a different opinion about this thing. So do many people. Like if you go to Messianic Jews up here in Branson, we're going to have a different opinion about it. All right, everybody's got one. All right. Let me get into this again. Now, the unleavened bread in the Bible has a symbol that you got to recognize. It means sin. All right? And Christ is the one that said, you beware of the leavening of the Pharisees. Right? The rising of the Pharisees. Beware of these things. All right? So often it means sin. So really what it's getting at, since that's what it represents, it's not so much that you don't have bread with yeast in it. It's that you do for these 7 days everything you can to keep sin out of your life for the period of the feast. All right? Now, what's classified as sin? Well, transgression against the law. Right? Because when you go to study like the book of Numbers, you'll find out at the Passover you can have strong drink, wine.
It's a party.
You're having a good time, right? Now, you have 2 solemn assemblies on each end, where that's not done. But in the middle of this feast, it's fun.
It's fun.
You're there to meet people. You're having, right. That's where you'd find a wife.
Right, yeah.
That's where you would meet old friends that have been gone. All right. Those things, a lot of things that we would go to college for to do would be done then on the feast days because to find a spouse is a valid reason to go to school.
Yeah.
Or at least it is when you go to school, they tell you that anyway. But you get my point, the feast days. They were very serious about the Sabbath for sure and about the feast days, but in the middle they were supposed to have fun. That's what they brought. They brought there. It was a celebration. It wasn't just this.
No, yeah, it wasn't just
stand around and
do what God
right.
says. Yeah, God is giving
it was
you a
fun,
chance to
right?
gather,
Yeah, right. And it was a celebration because you were celebrating the bounty that he for following his law.
That's right.
Is the big point of it, right? No, I just wanted to cover that because people kind of get hung up on it sometimes. I think it's more important to recognize that leavening is a sin, meaning sin, instead of meaning bread without yeast. To a Christian, then it means much more when you look at it that way. Right. Now the next one is the Feast of Weeks, right? Verse 9, 7 weeks shalt thou number unto thee, beginning to number the 7 weeks from such time as thou beginnest to put the sickle to the corn. Thou shalt keep the Feast of Weeks unto the Lord thy God with the tribute of a freewill offering of thy hand, all right, which thou shalt give unto the Lord thy God according as the Lord God hath blessed thee. All right, so this is called the Feast of Weeks. It's got another name, and it's escaping me right now. But I'm going to just go with the Feast of Weeks. It'll come to me sooner or later. Okay, and you see why. It's because it's based on sevens again. You have 7 sevens. 7 weeks, or 7 days to 1 week, you have 7 weeks. 7 times 7 is 49. All right, when the sun goes down on the 49th day, 50th day begins what's called, we call as Christians, the day of Pentecost, or the Feast of Pentecost. It's really called the Feast of Weeks. Now, again, we've covered this again. All right, this was that lead up to Mount Sinai, where God spoke to all the people, and they were so afraid they ran to the other side.
Told them don't come up.
Yeah. And that's when Moses said, well, you told us not to bring anybody up. And he says, you and Aaron get up here. Yeah. All right, we covered all that, all right? Well, that's the original Feast of Pentecost. Now, look at our other studies that we've done. We've studied this pretty good because when we did the Truth About Tongues, Acts chapter 2, we covered this really, really good. All right, so the next thing then that you see on Pentecost Day is the miracle of tongues. All right, where God speaks through an individual and everybody, regardless of their language, understands exactly what they said because it's broadcast to them. In their mind, they're hearing it in the exact dialect of the county that they grew up in. All right, so again, here on Pentecost Day, so what's the thing you get out of that? All right, Passover's important. Pentecost Day, God speaks. All right, so these things are important, and they're laid out this way for a reason. All right, what did Christ say? He said, I have foretold you all things. All right, I want you to hold on to that. He's foretold us all things. For now, just hold on to that. All right, let's finish this up. Verse 11, and thou shalt rejoice before the Lord thy God. Did it say this is a big, complete, solemn assembly? No. It's a party. Rejoice, have fun, enjoy.
Praise.
Right. You're there to find a wife or maybe your next wife. All right. You're there to see friends and loved ones that you've not seen for maybe the whole year.
It's actually the next part.
Is it? Okay. Thou and thy sons and thy daughters and thy manservants and thy maidservants and the Levite that is within thy gates. So don't leave out the Levites. Why? They don't have any land.
No.
You got to take them with you.
You got to help them
Yeah,
out.
that's right. That's right. All right. And the stranger and the fatherless and the widow that are among you in the place which the Lord thy God shall choose to place his name there. Right? Same thing goes until Jerusalem was over with. Then it's the cry where Christ takes his place. Right. And thou shalt remember that thou wast a bondman in Egypt, and that shalt observe and to do these statutes. All right. Now here's the last one. Thou shalt observe the Feast of Tabernacles 7 days after thou hast gathered in the corn and the wine. All right, now I like to call this the Feast of the Harvest.
Yeah.
And in some places I think it is called the Feast of the Harvest. All right? But either one, the Feast of Tabernacles or the Feast of Harvest, you know what they're talking about either way. We're talking about the time, the season, when they bring in all the stuff from the fields, all right, the things that farmers are doing. All right, verse 14, and thou shalt rejoice in thy feast, thou and thy sons and thy daughters and their manservants and their maidservants and the Levite and the stranger and the fatherless and the widow. that are within thy gates. 7 days shalt thou keep a solemn feast unto the Lord thy God in the place which the Lord shall choose. So this one's a little bit different. Passover, you're in captive Sabbaths, and it says you have fun in the middle. This is different.
Solemn.
This is solemn, all 7 days. All right. So what are they doing during this time? All right. The Levites, you remember said, don't forget the Levites, take them with you. Why? They're the ones that can read. All right. So the priests, when they're doing their tour, they didn't have just one priest. Yeah, it was set up where you had different shifts of priests through the year that would, they have different names. Abiah is one of them. The course of Abiah, they're called courses. And there were so many courses, and it took so many priests to run each course, and they lasted so long so that you didn't wear a priest out. It's pretty intense. He's working real hard while he's there, so they just keep a fresh one rotated in, basically. That kind of way I look at it. It was pretty rough. I mean, they're working. You're hauling water. You're splitting wood. You're doing all these things. You're making the sacrifices. Those things are physical. We just slaughtered. I was done after 2. Yeah. I mean, that's physical. So all these things are very, very physically taxing. So they didn't wear them out. They just had plenty of priests. You had a whole tribe of Levites to choose from. And then they just filled them as they needed them. All right. Nonetheless, 3 times, verse 16, 3 times in a year shalt thou males appear before the Lord thy God in the place which he shall choose. In the feast of unleavened bread, the feast of weeks, and the feast of tabernacles, and they shall not appear before the Lord empty. All right, and every man shall give as he is able. All right, there's no set amount. It's what he can. All right, you're not supposed to put them in a pinch to have a good time. All right, that able according to the blessings of the Lord thy God which he has given thee. All right, and so there you have all 3 feasts. All right, now Passover. So Passover, Feast of Weeks, Feast of Tabernacles. All right, and so Feast of Weeks is called Pentecost. Feast of Tabernacles, sometimes called the Feast of Harvest. Passover, sometimes referred to as Feast of Unleavened Bread. So you get a lot of different names. There's more. That's not all of them. You run into it occasionally, but you'll be able to sort out based on what you know from here in Deuteronomy, particularly what you do. All right, now. Okay, well, let me get a drink and sit down. I'm going to explain now. Flip over to the book in the New Testament, John. He's my favorite gospel. We're going to chapter 12. Okay. Now, let's talk about this a minute. We've been working Passover. Passover's coming up. Okay, so you count from spring 14 days, and when the sun goes down, Passover begins. That marks everything for your religious schedule then for the year. Now there's a lead up to Passover. Now the Jews have placed, particularly the contemporary Jews, the ones that are now, they all have these extra feast days added, okay? Because they got a big old list of feasts that lead up to Passover, then all the Passover stuff, and they do that with each of the feasts. It's one of their traditions. It's not a biblical one, And then it's kind of like why we have Thanksgiving, things like that. All right, but nonetheless, here we are in John in chapter 12, and we're into the lead up to Passover. So Christ knows this is it. He knows that during Passover on the 14th day of Abib, he knows that he will be crucified and he will be dead and put in a tomb. He knows these things are coming. And he's did this mission. He's performed all these miracles. And all these people adore him except for the scribes and the Pharisees. And they don't like this guy. And the main reason is because he went in and he kicked all the money changers out of the temple. So he's had enough of this. So told them exactly what they are. You're father serpents. You're just serpents, and you're in your clean house. He built a whip and whipped them and ran them out. All right, so from that point, these boys don't like him. It don't matter. He can raise all the dead you want to. It ain't going to change their mind. The only thing on their heart is to kill Christ. And they're going to eventually get their way. Right? Just like, you know where that line starts with that kind of an idea about just murder because of the idea of murder. All right?